Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And when I was a kid, I was awful at sports, like embarrassing, picked last guy at sports. And at times I would even be the recipient of what at the time I took as a compliment, which is the kind of statement where people would be like, "Oh my gosh, Mike, you're terrible. You can't hit any shots. Even Matt could have hit that shot." And I would be like, "Thank you. Oh, seriously, thank you guys for saying that, for thinking that I could have hit that shot." And then later I got to be like an adult or something, and then it occurred to me that that was not a compliment, and I should not have received it that way. Likewise, in Matthew 11, Jesus gives out a couple of those kind of quote-unquote compliments to the cities of Tyre and Sidon, really at their expense as well as at the expense of the cities of Bethsaida and Chorazin. Remember, this is the passage we talked about yesterday, where Jesus starts to pronounce these woes, these statements of regret and condemnation for these cities where his disciples went out and where he went out and where all these miracles apparently occurred, but nobody really signed up, or not very many people did. They saw the kingdom come into the light right in front of their faces, and they were like, I don't know, I'm just not really in the mood for a kingdom right now. I guess I'm not going to do it. And so Jesus in Matthew 11:20 expresses his displeasure with this. Then Jesus began to denounce the cities in which most of his miracles had been performed because they did not repent. He said, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! If the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." And I don't know, maybe the people of Tyre and Sidon heard about that later on and they were like, thanks for saying that. You think we would have done better than those guys? But again, not a compliment. But in the same way that if you really want to understand how bad the missed shot was that Mike or Jim or Timmy took in fourth grade while I was standing there off to the side just wishing I could play, that caused people to mock them by saying even Matt could have hit that shot, you kind of have to understand how bad I was at basketball as a fourth grader in order to appreciate it. And again, if you want to understand how deep a dig this is from Jesus toward the people of Chorazin and Bethsaida, you got to understand a little bit about these Tyre and Sidon people about whom Jesus is saying even they could have got this right. So Tyre and Sidon today, if you want to go and find them, they're in modern-day Lebanon, just a little bit north of the northernmost cities of Israel, the most maybe historically famous of which that is in their neighborhood would be Akko, or medieval Accra. Tyre is the more interesting of the two to me, and I don't really have time to break down both, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tyre. It is crazy ancient, like 3000 BC ancient, according to the Greek historian Herodotus. And though I've seen Tyre from a distance, I haven't actually wandered around there myself. Tyre, by the way, Tyre, not Tire. However, I have been to another city that claims to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continually inhabited city in the world, and that is the Greek town of Argos. And if you go there to Argos, which is in the same, at least zip code as Sparta, and really just right down the road from the very ancient city of Mycenae, you realize quickly that you're getting to a place where history and myth mush together into this indistinguishable slurry, where it's very hard to separate who were real characters and who were cyclopses that could move gigantic rocks. The same seems to be true of Tyre. And you might think, well, Tyre, though, that's got to have like ancient Near Eastern myths and stuff associated. But the crazy thing about Tyre is that their legends and myths fall much more into the orbit of the Greek stories and the Greek characters than they do into the orbit of the Canaanite and the Levantine stories. And you might be thinking, oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, they're kind of Greekish. Everything around there is Greekish by the time we get to Jesus. Yeah, but Tyre is different. True. About 350 years before the time of Jesus, Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian, Greek-ish, rolled through. He conquered the whole world. He brought Greek language and Greek culture and Greek women and Greek dudes and intermarried with everybody and Greekified, or created what is called by historians the Hellenistic world, the Greek-ish world. And that never really went away. The Greek culture at that point had been released, and it was just all over the world. But what's unique about Tyre compared to most of its neighbors on that eastern Mediterranean coast of modern-day Lebanon and Israel is that it had those Greek connections going much further back. In fact, one of the earliest legends about Tyre is that Zeus king of the Greek gods, showed up. He was on one of his carousing benders like he would go on. And he ends up in Tyre, and he sees there are these 4 kids there who are princes and princesses, and the princess in particular seemed to interest him, and her name was Europa. And so, as is the case in so many of these Greek stories, he just takes her, flees somewhere else. He absconds with Europa, and they have 3 kids on the island of Crete. And here's how influential and intertwined with Greek culture the history of Tyre is. Europa, the Tyrian princess, lends her name to the continent of Europe. I think she also got a moon, right? Yeah. And among those 3 siblings of Europa is a dude named Phoenix, and somehow he lends his name into the people group name, the civilization name that Tyre is the hub of, and those are the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians, as you well know if you can understand what I'm saying, had an alphabet. And the alphabet at this point was a very advanced concept. The fact that they had one tells us a lot about the cognitive level of the people of Tyre, dating all the way back into the super ancient world. They cross-pollinated alphabets with the Greek people. Some people even argue that the Phoenician alphabet entirely informed the Greek alphabet. But whatever the case, language is flourishing in these 2 cultures because they have a more flexible, multi-use system of characters than a lot of the other groups that are using lines and dashes and pictographs to try to communicate complex ideas. There's another element to that story about Zeus and Europa, though, that speaks back on the reality of history as well, and that's that they went to Crete. We know that the Cretans had crazy money that they earned by having a dominant navy and a dominant system of naval trade all around the Eastern Mediterranean world for a very long time. But we also know that the Cretans just went away one day. Maybe they were Atlantis. No, literally, like maybe they were Atlantis. Maybe they took such a hit with the eruption of Santorini. That's the modern name of the ancient Greek Isle of Thera, which erupted and destroyed a ton of stuff, maybe even factors into the story of the Exodus somehow. Maybe that wipes out Crete, but Tyre seems to survive it and even thrive more after the decline of Cretan Greek civilization. Now, Tyre's good at swapping all kinds of stuff. We know that Solomon and a very legendary king of Tyre, well, he wasn't a legend, he was just a big deal, Hiram the First, they swapped all kinds of things. They made each other rich. Cedars from Lebanon were very prized. But another thing that was a big deal that Tyre did is they took these little shells, these little crustacean things, and if they smashed up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, they could distill the remains of that mollusk that lived in these kind of shells into this incredibly valuable purple dye. And this Tyrian dye became associated with royalty. And so it's kind of fun that the name Tyrian is a description of an ugly, twisted up, wretched little thing that also is associated with nobility in a surprising way when it's put through a very rigorous, demanding process. If you're a fan of George R.R. Martin, you're an even bigger fan now because you appreciate all the more what he did there by picking the name Tyrion for a pivotal character in his books. So this is actually a really nice sounding story. How does all of it add up to Jesus likening Tyre to something as awful as my 4th grade basketball game and a cautionary example of what ineptitude looks like? Well, it has a lot to do with those Greek associations I've spent a bunch of our time highlighting here. The Greek thing was not real popular to Jesus' audience. Remember, Alexander the Great came along, dies, hands it off to his generals. One of those generals forms the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucids were not friends to the Jewish people. Eventually, one of those Seleucid emperors, a guy named Antiochus, went so far as to mess around with pork on the high altar. This is what prompted the Maccabees revolution that resulted in a free, independent Jewish state for a brief period of time, which eventually got toppled by the Romans. And so when Jesus is on the scene, you got a whole bunch of people who remember the glory days of when we got rid of those dirty Greeks, and then the Romans swept in opportunistically and hit us while we were still weak. And so we're mad at Rome and we're mad at Greece, but we're particularly feeling a religious friction in more conservative parts of Israel and Galilee, not just with the Roman presence or military presence, but also with this obnoxious specter of Greek culture that Alexander just went and indiscriminately scattered around everywhere. They want the Greek stuff gone. It's an affront to Jewish thought. It's an affront to who they are and what they believe. And so the fact that Tyre is as Greek a town predating even Alexander as there could be, is probably one of the reasons that it was not particularly popular with Jesus' original audience and would serve as this helpful negative example. Tyre also would have had a negative reputation here because of their buddying up with the really lousy northern kings of Israel, the kings that did such a bad job that it weakened Israel to the point that they ultimately got conquered by the Assyrians and effectively destroyed and lost to history. Also fresh in the mind of Jesus' audience would have been this unholiest of unions between Ahab, king of the north, and Jezebel, who was a Sidonian Tyrian princess, and them getting together was a complete disaster. Jezebel is the epitome in the minds of everybody in Jesus' audience of what a horrible, wretched, awful human, a horrible, wretched, awful woman would look like. And so that reputation precedes the cities of Tyre and Sidon as well. In addition to that, there are a handful of Old Testament prophetic pronouncements of judgment against Tyre. I didn't get through half of what I wanted to talk about these towns, but this has already gone on way too long. I just get excited about the history stuff. I think it's really fun when we get to think about what we have as a part of our historical record to reconstruct the emotions and the impulses and the reputations and the knee-jerk reactions that the original audience would have had to stuff that for us is a couple thousand years after the fact and is emotionless, but to them was still recent enough in their memory that they would have felt things about these different places. And so I'm sure whoever you are, there is a town or country somewhere that just epitomizes everything you hate ideologically, everything that to you seems backwards and you would never want to live there and you don't like the thinking that comes out of it. Well, whoever you are and whatever you're picturing, that is how the original audience would have pictured Tyre and Sidon. And still, we are not done with our geography and history as we unpack this passage. So we got more to go looking at Capernaum and Sodom and thinking about how they fit into the equation. Thanks for letting me nerd out about Tyre and dive extra deep into it this time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.